They say a mother's love is eternal. They say it knows no boundaries, no conditions, no limits. For 40 years, I believed that. I lived it. I breathed it. Every sacrifice I made, every sleepless night I endured, every dream I postponed. It was all for him, for Daniel, my only son, my pride and joy, my reason for living. I'm Maria Elena, and at 60 years old, I thought I knew what heartbreak looked like. I'd buried my husband when Daniel was just 12. I'd worked double shifts as a nurse, my feet swollen and my back aching, just to put food on our table and keep him in school. I sold my mother's jewelry, the only inheritance I had, to pay for his college tuition. I wore the same 3 dresses for years because his textbooks mattered more than my wardrobe. People used to tell me I was too generous with him. Maria Elena, my neighbor Carmen would say, watching me hand Daniel another envelope of cash for his emergency expenses. You're spoiling that boy. He needs to learn responsibility. But I would just smile and shake my head. Carmen didn't understand. She had 3 children. I only had 1. Every penny I gave him, every favor I did, every time I said yes when I should have said no, it was an investment in love. Or so I thought. When Daniel graduated and got his first job, I felt such pride. My sacrifice had paid off. He was educated, handsome, successful. He moved to a nice apartment across town, and though he didn't visit as often as I hoped, I understood. Young men need their independence. Young men have their own lives to build. I told myself this every Sunday when I cooked his favorite meal and he didn't show up. I told myself this every birthday when the phone didn't ring until the very last minute, if at all. After I retired from nursing, 40 years of caring for others, 40 years of working nights and weekends, I thought we'd have more time together. I thought maybe now, finally, he'd see me not just as the woman who gave him everything, but as someone who deserved a little something in return. Not money, not gifts, just time, just presence, just the acknowledgement that I existed beyond my usefulness to him. But Daniel had other plans. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment below to let us know which city you're watching from. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 months ago, when Daniel started asking strange questions. Questions about my health insurance. Questions about my will. Questions about the deed to my house. The little 2-bedroom home I'd owned for 30 years. The one I'd finally paid off after decades of careful budgeting and sacrifice. "Mom," he'd say during his rare visits, his eyes scanning my living room like he was taking inventory. "Have you thought about what would happen if you got sick? What if you couldn't take care of yourself anymore?" At first, I thought it was sweet. My son was worried about my future. My son was planning ahead. My son cared about my well-being. How naive I was. He brought papers for me to sign. Papers he said would protect my interests and make things easier if something happened to me. Power of attorney documents, medical directives, financial authorizations. "It's just paperwork, Mom," he'd say when I hesitated, his voice taking on that impatient tone I'd grown to recognize. "You trust me, don't you?" Of course I trusted him. He was my son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep when he had nightmares. The teenager I'd stayed up waiting for when he missed curfew. The young man I'd cheered for at graduation. Trust wasn't even a question. It was as natural as breathing. So I signed. I signed everything he put in front of me, my arthritic fingers gripping the pen while he pointed to each line that needed my signature. "Here, Mom, and here, and initial this one." I felt proud that my successful son was taking care of his old mother's affairs. I felt grateful that he was thinking ahead, planning for contingencies I was too naive to consider. I had no idea I was signing away my freedom. I had no idea I was signing away my life. The accident happened on a Tuesday. A simple slip on the stairs. The wooden steps I'd climbed thousands of times before suddenly became treacherous under my worn slippers. One moment I was carrying laundry to the second floor, humming an old song my mother used to sing, and the next moment I was lying at the bottom of the stairs, my head throbbing and the world spinning around me like a carnival ride. I must have called out for help, though I don't remember doing it. I must have managed to reach my phone, though the details are fuzzy. What I do remember is the ambulance ride, the bright lights overhead, the concerned voices of paramedics asking me questions I couldn't quite answer. "What's your name? What year is it? Do you know where you are?" Maria Elena Garcia, 2024. I'm at home, or I was at home. Now I'm floating in a sea of medical equipment and sterile smells and voices that seem to come from very far away. When I woke up 3 days later, everything was wrong. The room was wrong. The bed was wrong. The smells were wrong. This wasn't the hospital where I'd worked for 40 years. This wasn't the bright, busy place where doctors and nurses moved with purpose and families gathered in waiting rooms. This was somewhere else. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere that felt like the end of the world rather than the beginning of healing. "Where am I?" I asked the woman in scrubs who was checking my IV. She was young, maybe 25, with tired eyes and the sort of professional distance that comes from working in places where hope goes to die. "Sunset Manor Care Facility," she said without looking at me directly. "You're in good hands now." "But I don't understand," I said, my voice weak but growing stronger with confusion and fear. "I just had a fall. I hit my head. Why am I in a nursing home? Where's my son? I need to call Daniel." The nurse, her name tag said Jennifer, finally looked at me then, and something in her expression made my blood run cold. It was pity. Deep, profound pity mixed with something else. Something that looked almost like guilt. "Your son made all the arrangements," she said softly. "He said this was what you wanted. He said you'd discussed it before your accident. But I had never discussed this. I had never agreed to be placed in a nursing home. I was 60 years old, not 90. I was independent, capable, still sharp as a tack despite the head injury. Yes, I lived alone, but I preferred it that way. I had my routines, my garden, my small circle of friends from the hospital. I had my freedom. "There's been a mistake," I told Jennifer, trying to sit up straighter despite the dizziness that still clouded my thoughts. "I need to speak to my son immediately. I need to go home." Jennifer's face tightened, and she busied herself with adjusting my blankets. "I'm sorry, but visitors aren't allowed during your adjustment period. Doctor's orders. You need to focus on your recovery right now." Adjustment period? The words felt foreign on my tongue. I don't need an adjustment period. I need to call Daniel. I need to understand what's happening here. But Jennifer was already backing toward the door, her clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. The social worker will speak with you tomorrow about your situation. Try to get some rest, Mrs. Garcia. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in this sterile room with its thin curtains and institutional furniture. The silence pressed against my ears like cotton. No familiar sounds of my neighborhood, no children playing in the street, no Mrs. Rodriguez's radio playing mariachi music through her open window, no comforting hum of my old refrigerator that had been with me for 15 years. I tried to piece together what had happened. The fall, the hospital, and then nothing. A gap in time that someone had filled without my permission. How long had I been unconscious? How long had I been here? The medication they were giving me made everything fuzzy, made it hard to hold on to thoughts long enough to examine them properly. Over the next few days, I began to understand the scope of what Daniel had done. Piece by piece, like a puzzle made of betrayal, the picture became clear. I wasn't allowed phone calls. Part of your treatment plan, they told me when I asked to use the phone at the nurse's station. I wasn't allowed visitors. Too stimulating during your recovery period, they explained when I begged to see someone, anyone, from my old life. I wasn't even allowed to walk to the common area without an escort, as if I were a flight risk or a danger to myself. But I wasn't dangerous. I was inconvenient. The truth came to me in fragments, whispered conversations I overheard when the staff thought I was sleeping. Phone calls they took in the hallway outside my room, speaking in low voices about the Garcia case and family arrangements and difficult transitions. It was during one of these conversations that I learned the most devastating piece of information. I was lying in bed, pretending to doze while a nurse spoke to someone on the phone just outside my door. No, the family has been very clear, she was saying. No contact with the outside. The son explained that she gets confused easily, makes up stories, says people are trying to hurt her. Classic paranoia from the head injury. He doesn't want her getting agitated by well-meaning friends who might not understand her condition. My blood turned to ice. Confused? Paranoid? Making up stories? I had never been more clear-headed in my life, despite the medications they kept pushing on me. The only confusion I felt was about how my own son could do this to me. But there was more. He's been very generous with the monthly payments, the nurse continued. Says he wants the best care for his mother, no matter the cost. Very devoted son. You don't see that often these days. Monthly payments. Devoted son. The words twisted in my stomach like knives. I began to refuse the medications they brought me, hiding the pills under my tongue and spitting them out when the nurses left. I needed my mind clear. I needed to think, to plan, to understand what was happening to me. Without the chemical fog clouding my thoughts, the situation became even more horrifying. Daniel had essentially imprisoned me. He'd used the power of attorney I'd so trustingly signed to make medical and financial decisions on my behalf. He'd told the staff I was mentally incompetent, that I couldn't be trusted to make rational decisions about my own care. And they believed him. Because why would a loving son lie about his own mother? I tried to tell them the truth. I tried to explain that I was being held against my will, that I had never agreed to be placed in this facility, that my son was lying about my mental state. But the more I protested, the more they looked at me with that same pitying expression. The more they nodded and made notes in my chart about adjustment difficulties and resistance to care. My desperation grew with each passing day. I was a ghost in my own life, invisible to the world beyond these sterile walls. My friends from the hospital probably thought I'd moved away or was traveling. My neighbors might assume I was visiting family. No one would think to look for me here, in this place where forgotten people came to fade away quietly. But I wasn't ready to fade away. Not yet. I started watching the staff patterns, memorizing shift changes and medication schedules. I observed which doors were kept locked and which ones might offer an escape route. I began to exercise in my room when no one was watching, building back the strength I'd lost during my unconscious days and the subsequent weeks of forced inactivity. Most importantly, I started to listen. Really listen. Late at night, when the facility grew quiet except for the occasional call bell or shuffling footsteps of night staff, I could hear things. Conversations carried farther in the silence. Phone calls became clearer when people thought all the residents were asleep. It was during one of these late-night listening sessions that I overheard the conversation that changed everything. Changed my understanding of what Daniel had done and just how deep his betrayal ran. The night supervisor was speaking to someone on the phone in her office down the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and her voice carried clearly in the stillness. "The death certificate should be processed by the end of the week," she was saying. Yes, the son was very specific about wanting it handled quickly for insurance purposes. Said the family needed closure. Death certificate. The words hit me like a physical blow. I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from crying out, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it would wake the other residents. Daniel had declared me dead. While I lay in this bed, eating institutional food and begging to make a phone call, my son had told the world that Maria Elena Garcia was no longer among the living. He'd probably already collected whatever life insurance policies I had. He'd probably already sold my house, emptied my bank accounts, divided up my possessions like I was nothing more than an estate to be liquidated. In his mind, I was worth more to him dead than alive, and he'd found a way to make that literally true. The next morning, I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't lie in that bed and accept what was happening to me. I was a dead woman walking in the eyes of the law, but my heart was still beating, my lungs were still breathing, and my mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. I pressed the call button repeatedly until Jennifer appeared in my doorway, her expression already annoyed before I even spoke. "I need to speak to the administrator," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "I need to speak to someone in charge immediately. Mrs. Garcia, we've discussed this. You need to focus on your recovery. I am not recovering from anything except being kidnapped by my own son," I interrupted, my voice rising. "I know what Daniel has done. I know he's told people I'm dead. I know he's collecting insurance money and selling my house while I'm trapped in here like a prisoner." Jennifer's face went pale, but she tried to maintain her professional composure. "Mrs. Garcia, these are very serious accusations. The medication you're on can sometimes cause paranoid thoughts." "I haven't been taking the medication," I said, throwing back my blanket and standing up from the bed. "I've been spitting it out for days because I needed my mind clear to understand what was happening to me. And now I know. My son has committed fraud, and you people are helping him." The accusation hung in the air between us. Jennifer's training had probably prepared her for confused elderly patients, for people with dementia who made wild claims about family members stealing from them. But I could see in her eyes that something about my clarity, my specificity, was making her uncomfortable. I'll get the social worker," she said finally, backing toward the door. "No, you'll get the administrator. You'll get someone with actual authority who can make phone calls and verify what I'm telling you, because I'm not crazy, I'm not confused, and I'm not staying in this place one more day." But when the social worker arrived an hour later, she came armed with files and forms and the same practiced sympathy I'd been receiving since I woke up here. Her name was Linda, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes that somehow made her condescension even more infuriating. "Mrs. Garcia," she said, settling into the chair beside my bed like we were old friends about to have a pleasant chat. "I understand you're having some concerns about your placement here. That's very normal. Many of our residents feel confused or upset during their first few weeks with us." "I'm not confused," I said, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. "I'm a victim of fraud. My son has forged documents, stolen my money, and declared me dead while keeping me imprisoned here. I want you to call the police. I want you to call the hospital where I worked for 40 years and verify that I'm alive. I want you to do your job." Linda nodded sympathetically, making notes on her clipboard. "I can see you're very upset, but Mrs. Garcia, your son has provided us with extensive medical documentation about your condition. The head injury you sustained has affected your memory and judgment. What you're experiencing right now, these feelings of persecution, these beliefs that your family is conspiring against you, they're symptoms of your trauma." "Then call someone who knew me before the trauma," I said, desperation creeping into my voice despite my efforts to stay calm. "Call St. Mary's Hospital. Ask for Elena Rodriguez in the cardiac unit, or Dr. Martinez in emergency. They'll tell you I was perfectly competent before my fall. They'll tell you I never had any symptoms of dementia or paranoia." But Linda just smiled that patient, professional smile. "Mrs. Garcia, your son specifically warned us that you might make these kinds of requests. He explained that in your confused state, you might try to contact former colleagues and upset them with wild stories. He's asked us to protect both you and them from that kind of distress." The perfect trap. Daniel had thought of everything. Every attempt I made to prove my sanity only reinforced their belief that I was mentally incompetent. Every protest I raised only confirmed their diagnosis. The more desperately I fought to prove I was being held against my will, the more convinced they became that I needed to be held against my will. I spent the next 2 weeks trying every approach I could think of. I was polite and reasonable, explaining my situation calmly and logically. I was emotional and pleading, begging them to make just one phone call to verify my story. I was angry and demanding, insisting on my rights as a supposedly free citizen. Nothing worked. The staff had been thoroughly briefed on my condition. They knew I would claim to be the victim of fraud. They knew I would insist I was being held illegally. They knew I would try to convince them that my devoted son was actually a criminal who had stolen my life. And because they knew all of this in advance, everything I did only confirmed what they'd already been told to expect. I tried to befriend other residents, thinking maybe one of them could help me make a phone call or send a message to the outside world. But most of them were too far gone with dementia to understand what I was telling them. And the few who were still mentally sharp were too afraid of the staff to risk helping me break the rules. I tried to befriend the staff members, hoping to find someone with a conscience who might listen to me. But they'd all been warned about my manipulative behavior and my tendency to spin elaborate conspiracy theories to avoid accepting my situation. The worst part was the visiting day charade. Once a week, Daniel would come to see me, playing the role of the dutiful son checking on his declining mother. He would sit in the chair beside my bed, holding my hand and speaking to me in the gentle, patient tone people use with children or invalids. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he would ask, his voice full of fake concern. "Are the nurses taking good care of you?" The first time he visited after I'd learned the truth, I confronted him directly. "You told them I was dead," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "You're collecting insurance money while keeping me locked up in here like an animal." Daniel's expression never changed. He just squeezed my hand and turned to speak to Jennifer, who always hovered nearby during his visits. "She's been having these episodes more frequently," he said sadly. "The paranoid delusions are getting worse. She thinks I'm trying to hurt her somehow. It breaks my heart to see her like this." And Jennifer would nod sympathetically, making more notes about my deteriorating mental state and my increasing hostility toward family members. Daniel would lean over and kiss my forehead before he left, whispering just loud enough for the nurse to hear, "I love you, Mom. I'm doing everything I can to help you get better." But as he pulled away, his eyes would meet mine for just a moment, and I would see something there that chilled me to the bone. Not guilt, not regret, just cold calculation and the satisfied look of someone who had solved a problem efficiently and permanently. After his visits, I would lie in my bed and stare at the ceiling, wondering how a child I had carried in my womb, nursed at my breast, and loved unconditionally for 37 years, could look at me with such complete indifference to my suffering. How had my love created this monster? How had my sacrifices produced such cruelty? But even in my darkest moments, when despair threatened to swallow me whole, I refused to give up. I refused to let Daniel win. I refused to disappear quietly into this institutional oblivion he had created for me. I was Maria Elena Garcia. I had worked in emergency rooms for 40 years, dealing with life and death situations where quick thinking and determination meant the difference between saving someone and losing them. I had raised a child alone after my husband died. I had survived poverty, loneliness, and heartbreak. I was not going to be defeated by my own son's greed. Late at night, when the facility grew quiet and the staff was minimal, I began to plan. I studied the layout of the building, memorized the shift patterns, observed which doors were locked and which ones might provide an escape route. I exercised in my room to build back my strength. I saved food from my meals to sustain me once I got out. Most importantly, I started to remember. I remembered phone numbers of old friends, addresses of people who might help me, details about my life that could prove my identity once I found someone willing to listen. Because I was going to escape this place, I was going to expose Daniel's fraud, and I was going to reclaim my life, no matter what it took. 3 months into my captivity, because that's what it was, captivity, I reached a point where I almost gave up. Almost. It happened on a Tuesday morning when they brought me mail that had been forwarded to the facility. Mail addressed to me, but not really to me anymore. The first envelope contained a sympathy card from my old neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. Inside, in her careful handwriting, she'd written, "Dear Daniel, I was so sorry to hear about your mother's passing. Maria Elena was such a wonderful woman. She will be missed by everyone in the neighborhood. My condolences to you during this difficult time." My hands shook as I read those words. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had lived next door to me for 15 years, who had borrowed cups of sugar and shared gossip over the fence, who had watched me tend my garden every morning. She believed I was dead. She had probably attended my funeral. She had probably stood in a church somewhere, listening to Daniel give a eulogy about what a devoted mother I had been, never knowing that I was lying in a nursing home bed less than 20 miles away. The second envelope was worse. It was from the bank, addressed to the estate of Maria Elena Garcia. A formal letter explaining the closure of my accounts and the transfer of funds to my designated beneficiary, my loving son, Daniel. The balance listed was substantial. 40 years of careful saving, of living frugally and putting money aside for my retirement, for the possibility that I might need long-term care someday. Money that was supposed to ensure my dignity and independence in my golden years. All of it gone, legally transferred to the man who had erased me from existence. But the third envelope broke what was left of my spirit. It was a photograph, sent anonymously, with no return address. The picture showed Daniel standing in front of my house, my beautiful little house with the rose bushes I had planted and the front porch I had painted every few years. But there was a "for sale" sign on the lawn, and Daniel was shaking hands with a young couple who looked excited about their new home purchase. He was selling my house, the house where I had planned to live out my days, where every room held memories of raising him alone after his father died. The kitchen where I had packed his school lunches, the living room where we had watched television together on Sunday evenings, the bedroom where I had nursed him through childhood illnesses. All of it would belong to strangers now, people who would never know that a woman named Maria Elena Garcia had loved and lost and sacrificed within those walls. I sat on my institutional bed, holding that photograph, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I truly understood the completeness of Daniel's plan. He hadn't just stolen my money or forged my death certificate. He had erased me entirely. Soon there would be no physical evidence that I had ever existed. No house with my name on the deed. No bank accounts in my name. No mail delivery address. No neighbors who expected to see me watering my flowers or bringing in my newspaper. In every way that mattered legally and socially, Maria Elena Garcia was already dead. I was just a ghost who hadn't figured out how to stop breathing yet. That night, I lay in the dark and seriously considered giving up. What was the point of fighting when the battle was already lost? What was the point of planning an escape when I had nowhere to escape to? My house was gone. My money was gone. My identity was gone. Even if I somehow managed to get out of this place, who would believe me? Who would help a woman who officially didn't exist? I thought about my husband, Miguel, and how he had fought so hard against the cancer that eventually took him. I remembered sitting beside his hospital bed, holding his hand while he struggled for every breath, refusing to surrender even when the doctors said there was no hope left. "I'm not ready to leave you and Daniel yet," he had whispered. "I have to keep fighting." But Miguel had been fighting for his life. I was fighting for my death, for the right to be acknowledged as still living, still breathing, still deserving of basic human dignity. And unlike Miguel's battle against disease, my war was against someone who should have loved me, someone I had given everything to protect and nurture. The irony was suffocating. I had spent 40 years in emergency medicine, saving other people's lives, fighting death every single day. Now I was fighting for the simple recognition that I was alive and losing. In my darkest moment, Lying in that narrow bed with tears streaming down my cheeks, I almost reached for the call button to ask for sleeping pills. Strong ones. Enough to make this nightmare end permanently. If the world believed I was dead anyway, maybe it was time to stop contradicting them. But then I heard something that changed everything. Through the thin walls of the nursing home, I could hear Mrs. Patterson in the next room crying. She was 92 years old, completely lucid, and had been abandoned here by her grandson after he convinced a judge that she was no longer competent to manage her own affairs. She cried every night, soft whimpering sounds that broke my heart because I recognized them. They were the sounds of someone who had been discarded by people who were supposed to love them. Mrs. Patterson was dying. Really dying. From the lung disease that was slowly stealing her breath. But she was fighting every single day to hold on to whatever dignity she had left. She never complained about the terrible food or the rough handling by some of the staff. She never gave up trying to call her grandson, even though he never answered. She never stopped believing that somehow, someday, someone would remember that she mattered. If Mrs. Patterson could fight while actually dying, how could I give up while still fully alive? I wiped my tears and sat up in bed. In the dim light filtering through my window, I could see the reflection of my face in the mirror across the room. I looked older than my 60 years, thinner than I had ever been, worn down by months of institutional living and the stress of fighting a system designed to silence me. But my eyes were still clear. My mind was still sharp. My hands were still steady. I was not ready to become the ghost Daniel wanted me to be. That night, for the first time in months, I began to hope again. Not the desperate, frantic hope I had felt during my first weeks here, when I believed someone would surely discover the truth and rescue me. This was different, quieter, more determined. This was the hope of someone who had finally accepted that no one was coming to save her, which meant she would have to save herself. I began to plan more carefully, more strategically. I studied the building's layout during my supervised walks to the common room. I memorized the staff schedules, noting which nurses were more sympathetic and which ones followed the rules rigidly. I observed which residents received visitors regularly, and which ones, like me, had been forgotten by the outside world. Most importantly, I started to remember details about my old life that could serve as proof of my identity. Bank account numbers I had memorized years ago, the names and phone numbers of doctors who had treated me, the exact date I had started working at St. Mary's Hospital, and the names of supervisors who might still remember me. Little details that only the real Maria Elena Garcia would know. I also began to save things, small items that I could carry with me when the time came to escape. A plastic spoon from the cafeteria that I sharpened against the concrete wall of my room until it could serve as a tool. Packets of crackers and juice boxes that I hid in my pillowcase for emergency food. The photograph of Daniel selling my house, which I would need as evidence of his fraud. But most importantly, I saved my strength. I stopped wasting energy on trying to convince the staff of my sanity. I stopped pleading with Daniel during his weekly visits. I stopped crying myself to sleep every night over the injustice of my situation. Instead, I focused on the one thing Daniel had underestimated: my will to survive. He had calculated the financial benefits of my death. He had planned for the legal complications of forging documents. He had prepared for the possibility that I might resist his plans initially. But he had forgotten that I was the woman who had raised him alone after his father died. The woman who had worked double shifts to keep him in school. The woman who had sacrificed everything to give him the opportunities that had made his current success possible. Daniel had forgotten that I was a survivor, and that was going to be his biggest mistake. The opportunity came 6 weeks later, on a night when everything aligned perfectly for my escape. I had been watching, waiting, learning the patterns of this place like I was studying for the most important exam of my life. I knew that Thursday nights were when they brought in the new residents, which meant extra confusion and paperwork for the staff. I knew that the night supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, took her smoke break at exactly 2:15 a.m. behind the building. I knew that the security guard, an elderly man named Frank, dozed off in his chair between 2 and 3 a.m. while watching late-night television in the lobby. Most importantly, I had discovered that the service entrance near the kitchen was only locked from the outside. From the inside, it opened with a simple push bar, a fire safety requirement that the administration probably assumed no resident would ever be alert enough to exploit. That Thursday night, I waited until the facility settled into its usual quiet rhythm. I listened to the sounds of the evening shift change, the medication rounds, the final checks on residents who needed extra monitoring. When the clock on my nightstand read 1:45 a.m., I got out of bed and put on the clothes I had been wearing the day I arrived, the only clothes I owned that weren't institutional garments. My hands were steady as I gathered my small collection of survival supplies, the crackers I had saved, the photograph of Daniel selling my house, and a pillowcase I planned to use as a bag. I also took the sharp plastic spoon I had been working on for weeks, though I hoped I wouldn't need to use it. The hallway was dimly lit by security lights, casting long shadows that I used to hide my movement. My feet were bare. Shoes would have made too much noise on the linoleum floor, and the cold tiles sent shivers up my legs as I made my way toward the kitchen area. I had to pause twice when I heard footsteps, pressing myself against the wall and holding my breath until the sound passed. The first time it was a nurse doing rounds, checking on residents who wandered at night. The second time it was someone from the kitchen staff, probably preparing for the early morning breakfast shift. When I finally reached the service entrance, my heart was pounding so hard I was afraid someone would hear it. The door was exactly as I had observed. No electronic locks, no alarm system that I could see. Just a simple push bar that would release the latch. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any sounds from outside. Nothing but the distant hum of traffic and the whisper of wind through trees. I took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to Miguel's memory, and pushed. The door opened silently into the cool night air. For the first time in 4 months, I was outside without supervision. The feeling was so overwhelming that I almost collapsed right there on the loading dock behind the building. The air smelled different, fresher, full of possibilities instead of disinfectant and despair. I could see stars above me, something I had almost forgotten existed during my months of institutional lighting and small windows. But I couldn't afford to savor my freedom yet. I was still on the facility's property, still wearing clothes that would identify me as an escaped resident if anyone saw me. I needed to get as far away as possible before the next shift change discovered I was missing. I had studied the area around the nursing home during my brief supervised walks outside. I knew there was a shopping center about half a mile down the road, with a 24-hour gas station where I might be able to call for help. Beyond that, my plan was admittedly vague. I had no money, no identification, and no clear idea of where to go or who to trust. But I had something more valuable than any of those things. I had the truth. And somewhere out there was someone who would believe me. The walk to the gas station took longer than I had expected. My feet, soft from months of wearing only slippers, weren't prepared for the rough pavement and gravel. By the time I reached the brightly lit building, my soles were cut and bleeding, and I was limping badly. The young man behind the counter looked up from his magazine as I pushed through the glass doors. His expression went from bored indifference to alarm as he took in my appearance. An elderly woman in rumpled clothes, barefoot and bleeding, appearing out of the darkness like something from a horror movie. "Ma'am," he said, reaching for the phone behind the counter. "Do you need me to call someone? Are you hurt?" I realized how I must look to him. Wild-haired and desperate, probably seeming like exactly the kind of confused, wandering nursing home patient that families and staff warn convenience store workers about. If I wasn't careful, he would call the police, who would call the nursing home, and I would be back in that sterile room before dawn. "Please," I said, trying to make my voice as calm and rational as possible. "I need to use your phone to call an old friend. I know this looks strange, but I'm not confused or dangerous. I've been held against my will, and I need help." The young man, his name tag said Kevin, looked uncertain. His hand hovered over the phone, clearly torn between wanting to help and following whatever protocol he'd been trained to follow for situations like this. "Ma'am, maybe I should call 911 instead. If someone's holding you against your will, the police should—" "No," I said, perhaps more sharply than I intended. "Please, just let me make one phone call. To someone who knew me before all this happened. Someone who can verify that I'm telling the truth." Something in my tone must have convinced him, because Kevin nodded slowly and pushed the cordless phone across the counter toward me. "Okay," he said, "but I'm staying right here while you call." I picked up the phone with trembling fingers and dialed a number I had been rehearsing in my mind for weeks. "Please answer," I thought. "Please be awake. Please remember me." The phone rang 4 times before a sleepy voice answered. "Hello? Elena?" I said, my voice breaking with relief. "Elena Rodriguez? This is Maria Elena Garcia. I know this sounds impossible, but I need your help." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry," Elena said carefully, "but I think you have the wrong number. Maria Elena Garcia passed away several months ago. I attended her funeral." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Elena, listen to me carefully. Remember when we worked the Christmas Eve shift together 3 years ago, and you brought homemade tamales for everyone? Remember how we had to resuscitate that little boy who came in with pneumonia, and afterward you cried in the supply closet because he reminded you of your grandson?" Another pause, longer this time. "Who is this?" "It's me, Elena. It's really me. I know you think I'm dead because that's what Daniel told everyone, but I'm alive." "I've been trapped in a nursing home for 4 months while he stole my money and sold my house. I need you to help me prove who I am." I could hear Elena breathing on the other end of the line, processing what I was telling her. When she spoke again, her voice was shaking. "Maria Elena? Is it really you?" "It's really me," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm at a gas station on Route 47, near Sunset Manor Care Facility. I escaped tonight. Elena, I need someone to believe me. I need someone to help me prove I'm alive. Oh my God, Elena whispered. Oh my God, Maria Elena. Stay where you are. Don't move. I'm coming to get you right now. 20 minutes later, I saw Elena's familiar car pull into the gas station parking lot. Through the windows, I watched her hurry toward the building, her face tight with worry and disbelief. When she pushed through the doors and saw me sitting in the plastic chair Kevin had provided, she stopped dead in her tracks. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the fluorescent-lit space. Elena's face was older than I remembered, her hair grayer, but her eyes were the same kind eyes that had comforted so many patients over the years we worked together. It is you, she breathed. It's really you. And then she was across the room, wrapping me in the first genuine hug I had received in 4 months. I broke down completely then, sobbing against her shoulder while she held me and whispered reassurances in my ear. We're going to fix this, she said firmly. We're going to expose what Daniel did to you. We're going to get your life back. For the first time since I woke up in that nursing home, I believed that might actually be possible. I wasn't alone anymore. I had an ally, someone who could vouch for my sanity and my identity. Someone who believed me when I said I was the victim, not the confused patient everyone thought I was. But I also knew that Daniel had committed too many crimes and stolen too much money to go down easily. The fight to reclaim my life was just beginning, and it was going to be the hardest battle I had ever faced. Still, as Elena helped me into her car and drove me toward whatever came next, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Real, solid hope that I might actually win this war against my own son. Elena took me to her apartment, a small but warm place that felt like heaven after months of institutional living. She gave me clean clothes, a hot shower, and the first home-cooked meal I'd had since my imprisonment began. But more than the physical comfort, she gave me something invaluable: unwavering belief in my story. I never understood why Daniel had a closed-casket funeral, she said as we sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the watery substitute they served at the nursing home. He said you had been disfigured in the accident. But now I know why he didn't want anyone to see the body. There was no body. Over the next few days, Elena helped me piece together the evidence we would need to expose Daniel's fraud. It was like working a complex medical case, gathering symptoms and test results until the diagnosis became undeniable. First, we established my identity beyond any doubt. Elena took me to St. Mary's Hospital, where Dr. Martinez was still working in the emergency department. His reaction when he saw me was everything I needed to prove I wasn't a delusional imposter. "Maria Elena," he exclaimed, his face going white with shock. "But we all thought you were..." "Dead?" I finished for him. That's what my son wanted everyone to believe. Dr. Martinez sat down heavily in his chair, staring at me like I was a ghost who had just walked through his office walls. "The death certificate," he said slowly. "Daniel brought us a copy. He said you had died from complications following your fall. We all signed a sympathy card for him." "I'd like to see that death certificate," Elena said grimly. "Because I have a feeling there are going to be some very interesting signatures on it." We gathered more evidence over the following week. Elena drove me to my old neighborhood, where Mrs. Rodriguez nearly fainted when she saw me standing on her doorstep. "I brought flowers to your grave just last month," she whispered, crossing herself. "I prayed for your soul." "My soul is fine," I told her. "It's my son who has some explaining to do." Mrs. Rodriguez led us into my old house, or what had been my house. The new owners, a young couple with a baby, were kind but confused when we explained the situation. They showed us the sales documents, all perfectly legal, all signed by Daniel as the executor of my estate. "He seemed like such a devoted son," the woman said, bouncing her baby nervously. "He told us how hard it was to sell his mother's house, how many memories it held. We felt sorry for him." I walked through the rooms where I had raised Daniel, where I had loved him and sacrificed for him, and believed he was worth every hardship I endured. The new owners had repainted everything, replaced my furniture with their own, erased every trace of the 40 years I had lived within these walls. But I could still feel the ghosts of my former life here, still remember the sound of Daniel's laughter echoing from the backyard where he used to play. How had that laughing child become the man who could steal my home and erase my existence without a trace of remorse? Elena was documenting everything with her phone camera: the sales documents, the deed transfer, the mortgage papers that showed how quickly Daniel had moved to liquidate my assets. "This is going to be enough to bury him," she said with satisfaction. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Elena had contacted a lawyer she knew, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in elder abuse cases. Sarah took one look at my situation, and her eyes lit up with the fierce determination of someone who had seen too many elderly people victimized by their own families. "This isn't just fraud," Sarah explained during our first meeting in her office. "This is elder abuse, identity theft, insurance fraud, and probably several other felonies I haven't thought of yet. Your son has committed enough crimes to spend the next 20 years in prison." Sarah had connections in the legal system that Elena and I could never have accessed on our own. Within days, she had obtained copies of the fraudulent death certificate, the forged medical documents Daniel had used to justify my commitment to the nursing home, and the insurance claims he had filed using my supposed death. "Look at this," Sarah said, spreading papers across her conference table like a detective solving a murder case. "He filed for life insurance benefits 3 days after your supposed death. He had death certificates prepared and notarized by someone who clearly never saw a body. He forged medical examiner signatures. This isn't just greedy, it's sloppy. He got overconfident. The more evidence we gathered, the clearer Daniel's timeline became." He had been planning my erasure for months before my accident, setting up the legal framework that would allow him to have me declared incompetent and then dead. The fall down my stairs had just provided him with the perfect opportunity to put his plan into action. He probably drugged me, I realized during one of our evidence-gathering sessions. The night before my fall, I felt so dizzy and disoriented. I thought it was just fatigue, but he must have put something in my dinner when he visited. Sarah nodded grimly. "We'll never be able to prove that part now, but it fits the pattern. He needed you incapacitated but not dead, at least not initially. Much easier to have you declared mentally incompetent if you're actually unconscious and can't defend yourself." As we built our case, I learned that Daniel's fraud had been even more extensive than I had imagined. He had not only collected my life insurance and sold my house, but he had also claimed my Social Security benefits, emptied my retirement accounts, and even sold my car. He had literally liquidated every asset I owned, every penny I had saved over 40 years of hard work. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery was a series of emails Elena found when she contacted other former colleagues from the hospital. Daniel had been telling people for months before my supposed death that I was declining mentally, that I was becoming confused and paranoid, that he was worried about my ability to live independently. He was setting up the narrative, Sarah explained, making sure that when you disappeared, everyone would believe you had simply succumbed to the dementia he had been describing. Very clever, very calculated. Reading those emails, seeing how Daniel had systematically destroyed my reputation and relationships months before my imprisonment, was almost worse than discovering the financial theft. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my identity, my dignity, my place in the community where I had lived and worked for decades. But the emails also provided us with something valuable, a clear timeline of premeditation. This hadn't been an impulsive crime of opportunity. Daniel had been planning to erase me from existence for the better part of a year, carefully laying the groundwork for his fraud, with the patience of someone who understood that the perfect crime required perfect preparation. "This is actually good news for us," Sarah said when I expressed my horror at the depth of Daniel's planning. "Premeditation makes the charges much more serious." This isn't going to be a case where he can claim it was a moment of desperation or a misunderstanding that got out of hand. This was calculated, deliberate elder abuse. As we prepared to file our case, I found myself thinking about the other residents I had left behind at Sunset Manor. How many of them were there because their own families had found them inconvenient? How many Mrs. Pattersons were crying themselves to sleep every night, abandoned by people who were supposed to love them? "We're going to make sure this place gets investigated too," Sarah assured me when I brought up my concerns. "The fact that they held you for months without ever verifying your identity or questioning your son's story suggests serious problems with their admission procedures." The night before we filed our criminal complaint against Daniel, I sat in Elena's guest room and tried to process everything that had happened to me. 6 months ago, I had been an ordinary woman living a quiet retirement, proud of the son I had raised and confident in the security I had built through 40 years of hard work. Now I was a victim of crimes I hadn't even known existed. I was a ghost who had clawed her way back to life. I was preparing to send my own son to prison for trying to erase me from existence. The woman I had been 6 months ago would never have imagined herself capable of such a fight. That woman had been too trusting, too willing to believe that love could overcome any obstacle, too naive about the depths of cruelty that human beings could reach when money was involved. But that woman was gone, destroyed as thoroughly as Daniel had tried to destroy her identity. In her place was someone harder, smarter, more determined. Someone who understood that sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones you love most. Someone who had learned that survival sometimes requires you to fight the very people you had spent your life protecting. I wasn't the same Maria Elena Garcia who had fallen down those stairs. That woman had been a victim. This woman was a survivor. And tomorrow she was going to make sure that Daniel Garcia learned the difference. The morning we filed the criminal complaint, I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that Elena had helped me buy, the first new clothes I had owned in months. I wanted to look like the competent, dignified woman I had always been, not the confused patient Daniel had convinced everyone I was. Sarah met us at the courthouse steps, her briefcase filled with the evidence that would destroy my son's carefully constructed lies. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, studying my face with the concern of someone who understood that what we were about to do would change everything forever. I thought about Daniel as a little boy, crying when he skinned his knee and running to me for comfort. I thought about him as a teenager, embarrassed by my simple clothes and modest house, but still proud when I attended his school events. I thought about him as a young man, hugging me at his college graduation while I cried with pride at what we had accomplished together. Then I thought about him signing papers that declared me dead while I lay helpless in a nursing home bed. "I'm ready," I said. The detective who took our statement was a middle-aged woman named Lieutenant Rivera, who had clearly seen every variation of family cruelty that existed. She listened to our story without expression, making notes and asking specific questions about dates and financial details. "This is one of the most elaborate elder abuse cases I've encountered," she said when we finished our presentation. "The level of premeditation is extraordinary. Your son didn't just decide to steal from you, he orchestrated your complete erasure from society." Within hours, the wheels of justice began to turn with surprising speed. Daniel was arrested at his office that same afternoon, taken away in handcuffs while his colleagues watched in shock. The news spread quickly through our old neighborhood and the hospital where I had worked. The woman they thought was dead had returned to expose her own son's crimes. The local newspaper picked up the story, and suddenly I found myself at the center of a media storm that I hadn't anticipated. "Local nurse rises from the dead to expose son's fraud," read one headline. "The ghost of Sunset Manor seeks justice," declared another. But it was the photograph accompanying the articles that affected me most deeply. It showed Daniel being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. This wasn't the expression of someone who felt guilty about what he had done. This was the face of someone who was angry about being caught. Even in that moment, even facing prison time for what he had done to me, Daniel wasn't remorseful. He was indignant that his perfect plan had been disrupted by the inconvenient fact that I had refused to disappear quietly. The preliminary hearing was set for 2 weeks later. Sarah warned me that Daniel's defense attorney would try to portray me as mentally unstable, would claim that my months in the nursing home had confused me about what had actually happened. "They're going to say you're a confused old woman who doesn't understand the legal documents she signed," Sarah explained. "They're going to argue that Daniel was just following your wishes, that you had agreed to the nursing home placement and had given him power of attorney to handle your affairs." But we were prepared for those arguments. We had medical testimony from Dr. Martinez confirming my mental competency. We had sworn statements from Elena and my other former colleagues attesting to my clarity and intelligence. Most importantly, we had the timeline of Daniel's actions, which showed clearly that he had been planning my erasure long before my fall down the stairs. The day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread throughout the community about the woman who had returned from the dead to confront her son. I saw faces I recognized from my years at the hospital, neighbors from my old street, Even some of the nurses from Sunset Manor who had finally realized they had been participants in a crime. When Daniel entered the courtroom, flanked by his expensive defense attorney, he looked smaller than I remembered. Prison clothes didn't suit him the way his tailored business suits had. His hair was unkempt, his face pale from weeks in jail without the golf course tan he had maintained so carefully. For a moment, our eyes met across the courtroom. I had wondered what I would feel when I saw him again. Anger, hatred, maybe even lingering love for the child he had once been. But what I felt was something I hadn't expected. Pity. He looked like what he had always been underneath the expensive clothes and confident demeanor. A frightened, greedy man who had never learned to value anything that couldn't be converted into money. A man who had been willing to erase his own mother's existence for financial gain. Sarah presented our case with the methodical precision of a surgeon, laying out each piece of evidence like she was performing a delicate operation. The forged death certificates, the fraudulent insurance claims, the nursing home records showing how I had been held against my will while supposedly dead. The defendant didn't just commit fraud, she told the judge. He committed matricide, the murder of his mother's identity, her dignity, her very existence in society. He tried to make Maria Elena Garcia disappear so completely that no one would even think to look for her. Daniel's attorney tried to mount the defense Sarah had predicted, arguing that his client had been following my wishes and acting in my best interests. But the evidence was overwhelming. The timeline of premeditation, the forged documents, the systematic liquidation of my assets, the months of preparation before my convenient accident. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of everyone's attention on me. This was my moment to speak directly to Daniel, to tell him how his betrayal had affected me, to make him understand the depth of the pain he had caused. I looked at him sitting at the defendant's table, still refusing to meet my eyes, still maintaining the arrogant posture that suggested he was the victim of some terrible misunderstanding. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. 6 months ago, I thought I knew what love meant. I thought it meant sacrifice without counting the cost. I thought it meant trust without questioning motives. I thought it meant giving everything you had to someone because they were your family. I paused, watching Daniel's face for any sign of remorse, any indication that he understood what he had done to me. There was none. Daniel taught me that I was wrong about love. Real love requires respect. It requires seeing the other person as fully human, not as a resource to be exploited. It requires honoring the sacrifices that person made for you, not calculating how to profit from their vulnerability. Daniel's attorney placed a restraining hand on his client's arm as Daniel started to rise from his chair, his face flushed with anger. "I spent 40 years loving my son unconditionally," I continued. "He spent the last year of our relationship planning to erase me from existence. That tells this court, and tells the world, everything they need to know about who Daniel Garcia really is." I sat down to complete silence in the courtroom. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the moment of a mother confronting the son who had tried to destroy her. The judge took less than 10 minutes to reach her decision. "Mr. Garcia, she said, looking directly at Daniel with an expression of disgust that was unprofessional but entirely human. What you did to your mother represents some of the most callous, calculated elder abuse this court has ever encountered. You didn't just steal her money. You stole her identity, her dignity, and nearly stole her life. Daniel finally looked up at the judge, and I saw something flicker across his face that might have been fear. You are hereby bound over for trial on charges of elder abuse, fraud, insurance fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Bail is set at $500,000. The gavel came down like thunder, and just like that, Daniel's perfect plan crumbled into dust. His assets had been frozen pending investigation. His expensive attorney would now have to work on contingency. His reputation in the business community was destroyed beyond repair. As the bailiff led him away, Daniel finally turned to look at me one last time. I expected to see hatred in his eyes, or anger, or even the fear I had glimpsed moments before. Instead, I saw something that chilled me more than any emotion could have: complete indifference. Even facing prison, even confronted with the magnitude of his crimes, Daniel felt nothing for the woman who had given him life and spent 40 years nurturing him. I had raised a sociopath, and I had never seen it until it was almost too late. The trial took 3 months to conclude, but the verdict was never really in doubt. The evidence against Daniel was so overwhelming that even his expensive legal team couldn't create reasonable doubt about his guilt. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. When the judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, but a profound sense of closure. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the truth had been acknowledged. Maria Elena Garcia was officially, legally, and publicly alive. The restoration of my assets took longer than the trial itself. Daniel had been thorough in his theft, but Sarah was equally thorough in tracking down every penny he had stolen. My house had to be bought back from the young family who had purchased it in good faith, a complicated process that required court orders and insurance settlements. My bank accounts were restored with interest. My car was recovered from the dealer where Daniel had sold it. But the most meaningful restoration was smaller and more personal. Elena accompanied me to the cemetery where Daniel had erected a headstone in my name, a final grotesque touch to his elaborate fraud. We stood there together, looking at the granite marker that bore my birth date and a false death date, along with an inscription that made my stomach turn. Beloved mother, gone but not forgotten. He even lied on your gravestone, Elena said, shaking her head in disgust. The inscription is the worst part, I replied. If I had really been gone, I would have been forgotten. That's what he was counting on. The headstone was removed by court order, leaving an empty plot that I decided to donate to the cemetery for someone who actually needed it. I had no intention of being buried there when my real time came. That place had been contaminated by Daniel's lies. The media attention surrounding my case led to an investigation of Sunset Manor Care Facility. It turned out that my situation wasn't unique. The facility had a pattern of accepting residents without proper verification of their legal status or medical needs, as long as someone was willing to pay the monthly fees. 3 other families were found to have committed similar, though less elaborate, forms of elder abuse. The facility was shut down permanently, and several staff members faced charges for their roles in the abuse. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman whose nighttime crying had helped inspire my escape, was relocated to a legitimate care facility where she received proper medical treatment and was reunited with family members who had been told she was too ill to see visitors. "You saved more than just yourself," Sarah told me when the facility closure was announced. "Your courage to fight back exposed a system that was failing vulnerable elderly people throughout this region." But perhaps the most healing part of my recovery was rebuilding the relationships that Daniel had systematically destroyed. One by one, my former colleagues and neighbors learned the truth about what had happened to me. The sympathy cards they had sent Daniel were replaced with flowers and visits celebrating my return to life. Dr. Martinez offered me a part-time consulting position at the hospital, reviewing patient care protocols and training staff on recognizing signs of elder abuse. "Who better to teach us about protecting elderly patients than someone who survived what you survived?" he said. I accepted the position gratefully. After months of feeling powerless and invisible, it was healing to have work that mattered again, to be valued for my knowledge and experience rather than seen as a burden to be managed. I also began speaking at conferences about elder abuse, sharing my story with social workers, healthcare providers, and law enforcement officials. It wasn't easy to relive the trauma of my imprisonment, but each time I told my story, I could see the impact it had on the audience. People who worked with elderly patients began asking better questions, looking more carefully at family dynamics, recognizing warning signs they might have missed before. "Your voice is going to save lives," Elena told me after one particularly emotional presentation to a group of emergency room nurses. "Every person in that audience is going to remember your story the next time they see an elderly patient whose family seems too eager to make medical decisions for them." The house, when I finally moved back into it, felt different than it had before. I had it completely redecorated, erasing every trace of the life I had shared with Daniel. The room that had been his childhood bedroom became my home office. The family photos that had once covered the mantelpiece were replaced with pictures of my colleagues, my friends, and the new life I was building as a survivor rather than a victim. I kept only one photograph from my life with Daniel, a picture of him as a toddler, laughing as I pushed him on a swing at the neighborhood park. I put it in a drawer, not displayed, but not destroyed either. It served as a reminder that evil doesn't usually announce itself with horns and a pitchfork. Sometimes it wears the face of someone you love, someone you sacrificed everything to protect. A year after Daniel's sentencing, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from him, written in the careful handwriting I remembered from his childhood homework assignments. "Dear Mom," it began, and for a moment my heart leaped with hope that perhaps prison had given him time to reflect on what he had done, to feel genuine remorse for the pain he had caused. But as I read on, I realized that Daniel hadn't changed at all. The letter was full of self-pity and blame. He claimed that he had only been trying to protect me from making bad financial decisions. He insisted that the nursing home had been for my own good. He suggested that if I really loved him, I would use my influence to reduce his sentence. "I'm your son," he wrote. "No matter what happened between us, that bond should mean something." "I made mistakes, but I don't deserve to spend the best years of my life in prison for trying to take care of you." I read the letter twice. then placed it in my shredder and watched the strips of paper fall into the wastebasket. Daniel still didn't understand what he had done wrong. He still saw himself as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own downfall. That letter was the last contact I ever had with my son. He never wrote again, and I never tried to visit him. Some bonds, once broken by betrayal that deep, cannot be repaired. Some relationships, once poisoned by that level of calculated cruelty, are better left buried. Instead, I focused on building new relationships with people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide for them. Elena and I became closer than we had ever been during our working years. Sarah and I developed a friendship based on our shared commitment to protecting vulnerable elderly people. Dr. Martinez and the younger nurses at the hospital looked to me as a mentor and source of wisdom about patient care. I even found unexpected family in Mrs. Rodriguez, my elderly neighbor who had mourned at my supposed grave. We began having dinner together twice a week, sharing stories about our lives and supporting each other through the challenges of aging. She became the sister I had never had, proof that family can be chosen as well as born. On quiet evenings in my restored home, I sometimes thought about the woman I had been before Daniel's betrayal. She had been trusting, perhaps naively so. She had believed that love was enough to overcome any obstacle. She had sacrificed without counting the cost, given without expecting return. That woman was gone, and I didn't mourn her loss. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, more careful about who she trusted with her heart. Someone who understood that true love required mutual respect, and that unconditional giving could sometimes enable unconditional taking. I learned that sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones you love most. But I also learned that survival requires you to love yourself more than you love your abuser, even when that abuser is your own child. Most importantly, I learned that you can't erase someone who refuses to be erased. Daniel had tried to make me disappear, to reduce me to nothing more than a financial asset to be liquidated. But I had fought my way back from that living death, reclaimed my identity, and rebuilt my life on a foundation of truth rather than illusion. I was Maria Elena Garcia. I had been a nurse, a wife, a mother, and a victim. But most importantly, I was a survivor. And no one, not even my own son, could take that away from me. At 61, I was finally free to discover who I could become when I wasn't defined by someone else's needs or expectations. It turned out to be the most liberating feeling I had ever experienced. The old Maria Elena had lived for others. The new Maria Elena lived for herself, and it made all the difference in the world.